Good evening, everyone. I'm Robert Smythe, Executive Director of Hippogriff's History Channel here in London, England. Here I am in front of a replica of the 1607 Godspeed that took the original 104 settlers from Great Britain to North America, thus creating the prelude to the United States of America. In this series of documentaries about antebellum United States 1812 to 1861, I have the pleasure of introducing 14 distinguished scholars who are experts in this field of American history, all from some of the most prestigious universities in the world. In this episode, I'd like to introduce a nationally renowned scholar and an expert in his field on plantations in the Americas, the Honorable Professor Rohan Bera from Princeton University in New Jersey. Among his notable publications are the Organization of American Historians Prize winner, How Plantations Influenced the American Economy, and Cotton Was King. I will now leave you in his capable hands to discuss life as a Southern plantation owner in antebellum United States.
Welcome everyone to episode 7 in our series of documentaries about the antebellum United States 1812 to 1861. In the previous presentations, we discussed life as a northern factory owner, life as a northern factory worker, life in the rural north, life as a woman and child in the north, life as a new immigrant in the north, and life as a Chinese immigrant in the west. Professor Rohan Bera, a scholar of American history at the University of Princeton, and I'm now going to discuss life as a plantation owner in the South, 1812 to 1861. In the 18th and 19th centuries, there was an ever-increasing demand for cotton. During this period, over 90% of American cotton grown in the South was shipped to Great Britain and made a lot of people rich. Cotton was king. This meant there was a greater demand for land to make the high volume of cotton needed for exports. Processing cotton was very slow and time-consuming work. The invention of the cotton gin in 1794 helped speed up and increase the production. Since cotton was labor-intensive work, this increased the need for manual labor, so slaves were purchased from auctions. These slaves worked on the plantations where they grew cotton. A plantation was a farm that produced crops for cash. These were typically seen in the southern states such as Virginia, the Carolinas, and Mississippi. Most of them were huge with vast amounts of land. The warm climate, rich soil, and frequent rain meant that the southeast was ideal for year-round crop production. These states were initially used to grow tobacco, rice, and indigo. After the invention of the cotton gin, the main crop quickly became cotton. The textile industry was booming in Europe and just the beginning in the northeast of the U.S. Plantation owners in the South used African slaves as a form of labor to help produce the crops. This created a lot of wealth for the plantation owners. These plantations were key to America's early economy. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 opened up opportunities for Americans to move towards the frontier. As settlers moved west, plantation owners settled in the ideal warmer climates of the South. The Homestead Act gave the right for citizens or people who wanted to be citizens to claim up to 160 acres of land at no cost. For most immigrants, this was a lot of land. The eastern seaboard states such as Georgia, Virginia, and the Carolinas had already been using slaves for at least 100 years. Many Native Americans felt angered after they continued to lose their hunting grounds. The Indian Removal Act and westward expansion meant that Native Americans got pushed further and further west. The Trail of Tears pushed most of the natives in the southeast to Oklahoma. The land in the southern areas made it perfect for cash crops such as cotton. This made plantation owners a big part of success of westward expansion. With the invention of the cotton gin and the demands from Europe, cotton production was at an all-time high. Eli Whitney was the inventor of the cotton gin. The cotton gin's purpose was to remove seeds and debris from the cotton balls. Removing seeds was long, hard work. The invention of the cotton gin sped up this process. This also required fewer workers, which was more effective and cost-effective. Since there was a huge demand for cotton in Britain, the cotton gin helped increase the production, and America was profiting. As it became easier to produce cotton, most of the plantations started to grow it as a means of becoming rich. This was making the economy stronger, but was also fueling the slave-driven South and the factory-driven North. Just one person could produce 100 pounds of seedless cotton in a day with the cotton gin. Without the cotton gin, it took a person 10 hours to make a pound of seedless cotton. This invention changed everything and created a strong economy for both the North and the South. Plantation owners were the owners of the land that produced cash crops. They became a part of a wealthy group of people who had a strong political voice and held high standing in society. They oversaw their own plantations and were well organized and independent. They were very important and kept everyone in line. They also were the head of all the operations. The first 20 African slaves were captured from a Portuguese ship and brought to the Jamestown colony in 1619. This was the beginning of the African slave trade. When discussing the origins of slavery in America, it is important to consider the historical context and how it has impacted society. These slaves typically came from Africa or the Caribbean. Some slave owners would send them to England before bringing them across the Atlantic to America. In states like Mississippi, there were far more slaves than white citizens. From Africa to England, over 600,000 slaves were brought to the United States. They were purchased by the plantation owners at local slave auctions. Young, fit men were the most expensive slaves. There were many slaves involved in the running of a plantation. There were plantations that owned 2 to 10 slaves, to some with as many as 600. The number of slaves also varied depending on the size of the plantation. Nearly 90% of African Americans in the United States were enslaved. 90% of those 90% of African Americans were enslaved on farms and plantations. If there were only a couple of slaves, the plantation owner would watch them and whip them if they were not working. However, if there were more than 25 slaves, there were typically hired slave drivers. These slave drivers sat on horses and rode around the fields, forcing slaves to work. They were often loathed by the slaves. This would make the plantation more efficient. The past plantations were primarily utilized to make cash crops such as rice and tobacco. The introduction of the cotton gin resulted in an increased demand for cotton, making it the preferred crop grown on plantations. However, many plantations relied on slave labor to generate profits. While this economic model was popular at the time, it is a controversial topic between the North and the South. Southerners wanted to maintain their standard of living. Many Northerners wanted to abolish slavery. This division created many problems and eventually led to the American Civil War. There were 200 to 600 slaves on these big plantations. These slaves ran the plantations. Without these slaves at the plantations, there were no profits. These people were very important to the history of the United States. Unlike big factory owners who paid their employees, plantation owners did not care because at that time slaves were looked as property and not people with their own rights. They believed that they were inhumane. Needless to say, the factory workers in the North were not treated much better. A couple of the biggest differences were the pay and how the factory workers had more rights. Unlike slaves, they were allowed to leave the factories and go home to their families at night. Many respected historians believe that these plantation owners and their slaves were the sparks to ignite the Civil War. Many of the plantation owners married rich white females. They also often met at social gatherings or at church on Sundays. Their kids would be well educated and taught how to manage the plantation for the next generation. Plantation owners loved to converse with each other. They would typically do this at one of their plantations while drinking tea. They would also hunt a lot, especially since they had lots of land. Many discussed economics and politics. Many house servants were typically treated poorly. They were treated like workers at northern factories. Since they were white, they still had rights, but they were treated almost like slaves. These servants would sign a contract to work for their master. Once that contract was up after 5 to 7 years, they were given freedom. Food that plantation owners ate depended on their wealth. Most rich plantation owners would eat seafood and beef, which were overlooked as more expensive and lavish foods. On the other hand, less wealthy plantation owners would feast on the most basic foods like bread, chicken, mutton, and on occasion beef. Most of their leftovers would go to the more expensive slaves. The lower valued slaves would receive old and hard bread and stew with the rest of their leftovers. Many plantation owners became extremely wealthy during this period of American history. The invention of the cotton gin allowed cotton to be mass-produced. There was a great demand for cotton in Great Britain. Slaves helped grow cotton on the plantations. This fueled the political issues about slavery and the battle of the North versus the South. The American Civil War ended slavery in 1865. The 13th Amendment banned the use of slavery in the United States. Southern plantation owners had to free their slaves. Some slaves offered to be hired by their former owners. This made a great contribution to the economy of the United States. This made the government richer and also gave many people opportunities to live the American dream. People of African descent suffered greatly at the hands of the dominant white culture.